Hi, I'm going to be doing a series of 3 short videos where I'm going to cover stuff I've already covered in previous videos, but I'm going to focus on one single argument at a time. I want to create 3 reference videos that I could quickly link to someone if I need to just answer one specific question. So these 3 videos have to do with the 3 main arguments that Adventists who at some point stopped buying into the Adventist theological system, it's usually these 3 arguments that cause them to lose faith in the Adventist way of thinking. So I want to take each one of these 3 arguments and show that they're really flawed. And it's unfortunate that several generations of Adventists have abandoned the Adventist theological approach because of these 3 arguments that are just basically flawed, and there was no reason for any of this. Okay, so the first one, actually, the 3 arguments are the argument regarding Daniel 8. So Adventists believe that in Daniel 8, the little horn represents Rome, and we build our whole system from there. But people say, no, that's not Rome, it's wrong, it's supposed to be Greece, it's supposed to be Antiochus Epiphanes, right? So that's the first argument. The second argument, it's about Hebrews 9. So Adventists say that when Jesus went up to heaven, he went into the holy place, and then he went into the most holy place in 1844. While the book of Hebrews in chapter 9 and other places says that Jesus went straight into the most holy place at his ascension. And finally, the third argument is the argument that the Adventist idea of the investigative judgment leads people to causes people not to have an assurance of salvation. So these are the 3 arguments I'm going to address in the next 3 videos. Okay, so this video focuses on Daniel 8. So when it comes to Daniel 8, outside of Adventism, there's general consensus that the passage is talking about Greece and about Antiochus Epiphanes. So basically, Daniel 8 starts to talk about the Medo-Persian Empire with using the symbol of a ram. Then he has the symbol of a goat with one major horn, which is Alexander the Great. But then that horn collapses and you get 4 of them, which represents the 4 generals that took over Alexander's kingdom. And then there's another little horn that comes up at some point. And the majority of Christians, pretty much everybody outside of Adventism, says that represents Antiochus Epiphanes, which is one of the Greek kings. So yes, there is consensus at that. But what a lot of people don't mention when they talk about this topic and when they contradict Adventists is that there isn't consensus on the previous chapter and how people interpret the previous chapter, Daniel chapter 7. So when it comes to Daniel chapter 7, if you just do a search for various commentaries, fairly wide selection of commentaries, you find that there's 2 ways that people approach it. The first option is that people say, okay, in Daniel 7, you have 4 different beasts, and these 4 beasts represent Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. And then out of the 4th beast, there's a little horn. So the little horn in chapter 7 is a little horn that comes out of Rome. Then they go to chapter 8 and they say, well, the 2 beasts are the ram and the he-goat. The ram is Medo-Persia and the he-goat is Greece. And then the little horn is one of the Grecian kings, the Antiochus Epiphanes. So that's one option of how people interpret those 2 chapters. The other option is to say, no, let's start from chapter 8. Medo-Persia and Greece are represented by the 2 animals. Then you have the little horn coming out of Greece. And then the little horn in chapter 8 is very similar to the little horn in chapter 7. So that should also be taken as Greece. And then you work backwards and you find 4 kingdoms going backwards from there. So the 4 kingdoms are Babylon, Media, Persia, and then Greece. And you don't actually get to Rome in chapter 7. So these are the 2 options of how different commentaries interpret those 2 chapters. So yes, there is consensus on chapter 8 and on Daniel chapter 8. Pretty much everybody disagrees with Adventists, but they don't have consensus on chapter 7. So what exactly does that mean here? So anyway, just some errors here showing that one option has the little horns as being belonging to two different kingdoms, while the other option says that they belong to the same kingdom, the kingdom of Greece. So what we get out of this is that by purely exegeting the two chapters, it's not possible to arrive at consensus. Some people think it's better to go with one option. Some people think it's better to go with the other option. You could do a wide search of different commentaries on this, and you see that different people have interpreted these in different ways. So how do we address this difference of opinion here? Well, we can basically assign some kind of probability to this. And I'm just making up numbers. It could be the other way around. It could be some other probability, but basically we could say we're dealing with symbols. It's not possible to know for sure which is the correct option. So maybe there's 60% probability that option 1 is correct. Maybe there's 30% probability that option 2 is correct, which means that we need to acknowledge the fact that when we're interpreting prophecy and we're interpreting we're dealing with symbols and we don't actually know what those symbols are, there's some degree of uncertainty here, and we have to work with probabilities rather than pretending like we know for certain that this one option has to be the correct one. Okay, so the problem with this whole thing is that if you have one group of people that say, okay, the textual evidence for the four beasts is so strong that we need to interpret them as Babylon, Middle Persia, Greece, and Rome. And then when we get to chapter 8, we need to have the two little horns being two different kingdoms, because the evidence for the four kingdoms in chapter 7 being those kingdoms is really strong. Then that's what the people in the first option are arguing. The people in the second option are saying that the similarities between the two little horns are so there's so much similarity between them that we need to keep them as representing the same thing, which means we should reorganize how we view the other empires. So we need to have Babylon, Media, Persia, and Greece, and finish up with Greece in chapter 7, so that we could keep the little horns being the same, representing the same thing. So some people feel like the first set of criteria is stronger, so they need to keep the four kingdoms going up to Rome. And the other people feel that the similarity between the two horns is a stronger criteria, so we need to shift everything up and keep both of those as being Greece. But if that's the case, then logically speaking, there should also be a third probability or a third possibility, which is that let's keep we have the reasons for keeping the four kingdoms going up to Rome in chapter 7, but also have the similarity between the two horns between chapter 7 and chapter 8. And then that means in chapter 8, it could also be that the little horn represents Rome, which is the Adventist position. So in other words, if those two are valid possibilities, those for option 1 and option 2 are valid possibilities, then option 3 logically has to be a valid possibility as well. Otherwise, we have to deny not just option 3, but one of the two other options as well. So we have to say, no, it's 100% option 1, there's no room for option 2, or it's 100% option 2, there's no room for option 1. That's the only way to make that argument. If we allow for the possibility of these two options, logically speaking, we have to allow for the possibility of option 3 as well. And unfortunately, there is no way to arrive at 100% certainty here, because the majority of people that have studied this, the theologians historically have gone with both options, right? So because this is the interpretation of the symbols, it's a matter of probability. We could say, yeah, option 1 maybe has a 60% probability, option 2 has a 30%, but there's also option 3, and maybe there's a small probability there, only 10%, but that is also a valid way to interpret these passages. So in other words, after all these years of people debating Adventist on Daniel chapter 8 and saying that our whole thing is wrong and we misinterpreted the chapter, if we're really looking at the way these things work and the way people have interpreted these things, we have to allow for that as a valid option as well. And somebody might say, well, why are you going to build your theology on a 10% probability? But we're not building it on that, because we're not just basing our opinion on this on that one line of evidence and nothing else. So basically, the way we approach the topic is by going through a whole list of other things first. So we start off with theology as a whole. So what are our presuppositions when we come to do theology? What are our authority sources? What are the first epistemic conditions that we have to take in order to do our theology? And once we figure that out, then we got to have certain presuppositions about the nature of Scripture. I've covered all this stuff in my previous videos. Then we have our macro hermeneutical lenses. So like when we approach Scripture as a whole, what are the lenses through which you interpret it, the big picture elements that we use to interpret everything. Then we start and we do our interpretation of the whole of Scripture, not just some passage in Daniel, not just some prophecy here and there. We're doing the whole thing. So we're interpreting all of Scripture. Then once we go through that, then we zero in on prophecy in general. So how is prophecy interpreted from beginning all the way to the end of Scripture? And then we go into Daniel and we look at these passages. So we don't start with Daniel and we say, well, everybody else is going with this probability or that probability, but we're going to go with the one that's only 10% likely. We're not just jumping into that and choosing the one that's the least probable. We're coming at it with this whole other elements in place way before we even approach the prophecy. And when we do that, the rest of our thought process lines up very well with that small probability. And it's basically it's nobody else's business how we do that whole thing, because if we follow that whole thing, it's logical all the way through, as long as this is one valid way to interpret a text. And I just demonstrated here that it has to be one valid way to interpret a text, as long as we allow for the other two options. And that's already been allowed for. I mean, theologians that have studied this have already chosen to go with one or the other. It's there's tons of people that have done both options, so that's already there. The fact that there's two ways to go about these two chapters, that's already present. So that means there's room and there's logical necessity for this third possibility as well. And as long as that possibility is there, and it has to be a valid possibility logically, then Adventists are justified in working with it because it fits in within our overall system after we follow all the previous steps that I've already mentioned. So, it's been decades that Adventists have had to deal with this issue, and a lot of people have lost their faith or interest in Adventist theology because of this and the other two elements that I'm going to discuss in the next videos. And there's no reason for it. I mean, that option is there, and it's a valid way to interpret a text, and Adventists are perfectly justified in going with it.